For some, hockey is more than a mere game. It is a passion born in youth, a desire to be the best, to face the foe and emerge victorious. What began as a simple game has long since left the frozen pond. The torch of victory has become a guiding light, passed from generation to generation. Lord Stanley's Cup remained the prize as the quest for hockey greatness crossed the continent. A sheet of ice has become a stage where dreams are made real, where rivalry and competition would discover the best. Dedication and inspiration are the hallmark of the heroes that have led the way, the greatest players to ever take the ice, the legends of hockey.
When I was a young kid, back home, there was only three things that really mattered. It was politics, religion, and hockey. And for me, hockey came first.
My dream is start when I was 7 years old. Soon I had my first skate, I think. I said one day, I'm gonna be a hockey player.
My dream was to play hockey ever since I was 8 years old and was asked by a guidance counselor what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I said, play hockey.
And through it all, the people I played with, played against, the friends that you make, that would not have been possible without being involved in hockey. So I have hockey to thank for all that.
To me, this is what I love about the game, is the people that were there that made you play to your utmost and made you play to your best. And we didn't cheat the fans, believe me.
There were times in my life when I really felt, the only time I really felt good was when the doors opened and I got on the ice. And that lasted a long, long time. That's really where I found my peace.
The game has given me a lot throughout my career, and the game means everything to me.
I'm still at it, and I'm still at it because I love it, because I like the competition.
Nothing in the world matches the life of a hockey player.
Everything I own, I can thank the hockey. You know, I was in hockey all my life.
I always tell guys who come in, you should feel privileged and honored to play on this team and in this league. It's a special place.
And I'm the luckiest guy in the world to have been part of the greatest game in the world, hockey.
There's a lot of people today who I've known for 20 years that don't know my right name. The only place I get called Lorne is at home. So by the family, you know, so now that I'm older, they call me Lorne. But when I was playing, it was always Gump. I got it pinned on myself, really, when I went to play junior. You got to give all your statistics, and you had nickname, and I put Gump down, and it stuck.
I can remember the first time I saw him playing for the New York Rangers. He looked like a kid who had just sneaked over the fence and got into the game. He had tousled, closely cropped hair. The Ranger uniform flopped all over him. He flopped all over the ice. He was just incredible in what he was doing, but he still gave you the impression that he shouldn't be there. He just sneaked in.
Gump came to the Rangers in the early 50s, and they had become a very Humpty Dumpty team. And the first thing he did was win the Calder Trophy as a Rookie of the Year. Now, when you're the Rookie of the Year, you got one hell of a career ahead of you, right? Wrong.
I went in and asked for a $500 raise and ended up in the minors. Not like now when they ask for a $5 million raise and get it.
And if somebody once asked him, which team bothers you the most when he was with the Rangers? He says, the New York Rangers. You know, that, of course, is Gump. I mean, he always had a quick flip answer for you. And you know what? He was right.
Gump's coach in those days was Phil Watson, who was nuts. And the interplay between the two was almost like a comedy team, except that Gump didn't think it was funny and Watson didn't think it was funny.
He was the type of coach that when we won it was I, and when you lost was always me. He pointed at me or somebody else, but most of the time me. He called me a beer belly one day, and I said, I don't drink beer, I drink VO. And I said, not only that, I was here when you came, and I'll be here when you are gone. And the next week he was gone.
But it wouldn't be long before Gump himself would leave New York in a fortuitous trade to Montreal.
When he came to Montreal in the trade with the Rangers in the mid-'60s, his equipment arrived, and he likes to tell the story about how it was all laid out in front of him in the dressing room. And Toe Blake came by, the coach. And Blake said, when's the rest of your equipment get here? And Gump said, that's it. He said, Blake looked at me and said, you're crazy.
I wore shoulder pads all my career, the same shoulder pads from junior right through pro. They were about as thick as a quilt, but you're not supposed to get hit in the arms anyway, you're supposed to catch them, so that's what I kept telling myself.
In 1965, in his second season with Montreal, Gump was at the crease for the final do-or-die Stanley Cup game against Chicago. But getting the injured star goalie fit for this match had required drastic action.
I took a medicine that they had to get permission from Ottawa to give it to a human. It was only given to horses. And my breath was so bad that I was in 10 feet of someone. They say, what the hang is that smell?
But the potion had worked. Gump had shut out the opposition to win the first of his 4 Stanley Cups.
I don't know if there was a goaltender who's ever played who let it all hang out with his emotion facially when they would score against him. I remember he used to drop kick the puck into the crowd. If he got mad, he'd fish the puck out of the net. He could do it really good. They would go right up over the glass and into the crowd. That was him, and boy, that was the kind of closeness that fans were able to have with the players in those days.
On the ice, Gump was fearless, but his fear of flying made road trips with the team unbearable. So Sam Pollock, the general manager, sent him to the team psychiatrist.
I went to a shrink. The shrink told me, he says, the only one thing I can tell you, change occupations. I looked at him, I said, change occupations, are you crazy? And I went to Sammy Pollock, and he said, what did the doctor tell you? He said, to change occupation. They fired the shrink from the Canadians.
Gump was always the curmudgeon on and off the ice, even when he decided to hand in his notice. As always, his better half was the first to know.
I phoned my wife when I quit Canadians. I said, I'm quitting. She says, come on home. And I went up and told Sammy Pollock. I went in his office and I said, Sammy, I don't want to play anymore. I'm quitting.
But Gump wouldn't be away from the game for long. This was the expansion era. Good goalkeepers were always in demand. The Minnesota North Stars soon had him in the crease until he retired from the game in 1974.
I mean, there'll only ever be one Gumper in hockey, and it was him, and he played that role. He was able to carry that image right through to the end of his career when he was playing in Minnesota.
When you're playing, you figure it'd never end. But it ended, and I was happy with my career. I don't owe any money. Thank God for small favors. Thank God for a good wife. And everything I own, I can thank the hockey.
Let me give you a little sentence that my dad told me a long time ago. He says, if you're gonna make love, do it to your best or don't do it. And I think the same applies to playing this game. If you don't do it at your best, you're cheating people. Don't do it.
Marcel Pronovo heeded his father's words well. Every night on the ice, a tough defenseman, whatever the situation, played with a passion.
I've played with broken ankles. I've played with broken thumbs. I've played with separated ribs. It's just that way. I've seen guys play with worse. If you can walk and if you can talk, you can play.
Marcel played junior with the Windsor Spitfires before joining Detroit's farm system, but could only have dreamed of the dramatic call to the Red Wings for the 1950 Stanley Cup playoffs.
This is the year that Howe got hurt, and I played all but 3 games, and we had a do-or-die series against Toronto.
After defeating Toronto, Detroit and 19-year-old rookie Marcel Pronovo would face the New York Rangers.
Marcel Pronovo grabs the loose puck and heading and hits him with pallet check. Pronovo tries again, but the Rangers cover up.
Overtime, Game 7. New York was beat. Marcel's name was on the Stanley Cup.
I remember the game very, very well, but when you look back onto it, it's like foggy. It's like something that you saw happening, but it didn't happen to you. That's the kind of feeling that it gives you.
Marcel Pronovo speaks out of the Detroit zone, one of the fastest rushing defensemen in the game.
I had enough confidence in my ability because I could skate, and I could skate with any one of them. So as long as I could move, I could get out of the way.
Marcel's talent helped propel a brilliant Red Wings team to 3 more Stanley Cups in the next 4 years. Pronovo was an intense competitor.
What I enjoyed more possibly than scoring goals was throwing a good body check at somebody or a hip check.
When he whacked them, they stayed whacked. He wasn't a dirty player. He was just a really heavy hitter.
He was a big guy by NHL standards, and he could really body check. And he was a guy that I often thought the Leafs, they were my team when I was a kid, should trade for, you know. And if they could only get Pronovo, they'd be better.
In 1965, Marcel was the key to an 8-player trade to Toronto. Here, he was reunited with his old teammate, Terry Sawchuk. But there was a small family matter to sort out.
When I first went to Detroit, Dad was always a Canadiens fan. Then he switched and became a Detroit fan. He still liked his Canadiens, but he pulled for Detroit. Then when I was traded to Toronto, I happened to go back home and sat with Dad, and he says, you know, son, he says, when you went to Detroit, he says, it wasn't too bad leaving my Canadiens, he says, but he says, don't expect me to cheer for Toronto.
He came to a team that wanted him, and once we had a chance to win the cup, I think he got very excited. He played like a young kid, he practiced like a young kid, and me being the young guy on the team, along with Mike Walton and a couple others, we had to look at this guy and say, if Marcel can do it, so can we.
The team was written off by the media as being over the hill. But in the 1967 playoffs, Marcel and Toronto faced Montreal in the finals. Pronovo, the rushing defenseman, scored in Game 5. Game 6 brought the Stanley Cup back to Maple Leaf Gardens. Marcel Pronovo retired from the NHL in 1970 with 5 Stanley Cups in his 21-year career.
But the biggest thrill of all my life, bar none, was the day I was inducted in the Hall of Fame. And I thank the good Lord today that both Mom and Dad could see it.
Stopping the puck is what matters. That's why goalkeepers are relatively simple. They only have to think of one thing, and that's stop the puck. In those days, hockey was a poor man's sport, and I think coming from Saskatchewan, we qualified very well, and we couldn't believe that the rich kids didn't play hockey. They didn't. They really weren't that interested, and we thought that everybody had to be interested in playing hockey. When I really settled down in goal, I was probably 10, 12 years old. If you played on a on a poorer team, well, there was lots of action around, and that's what you enjoyed about the game.
Glenn Hall joined the Detroit Red Wings, where he earned Rookie of the Year honors in 1956 with 12 shutouts and introduced his own distinctive style.
Glenn Hall is the father of the butterfly style of goaltending that every goalie uses today.
It was considered in those days, they called it flopping, and they said, oh, he's down, you can't play when you're down, and you can't do this. And it was not an accepted way of stopping the puck.
If you looked at him on tape now, you'd wonder what the fuss was about, of that butterfly style and going down on your knees. Relative to a contemporary goalie, he's a stand-up goalie. He hardly goes down at all. But compared to goalies of his generation and of those that preceded him, he played the way goalies weren't supposed to play.
Hall was traded to Chicago after 4 years as a Red Wing. He would spend 10 seasons as a Blackhawk, winning a Stanley Cup in 1961. Yet, goaltending never came easy for Glenn Hall.
A remarkable save by Glenn Hall.
Glenn Hall once said, I like everything about hockey except playing.
It's a familiar story now about how Glenn used to get sick to his stomach even between periods of a tough hockey game.
I can remember games in Montreal. I was the official scorer in those days at the Forum, and the game would begin, and a couple of minutes, Glenn would signal to the referee, and he would skate off and go into the dressing room. Everybody knew what he was doing. The other team, the Canadians, would know. They would just stand around. Nobody made a fuss about it. Glenn would come back out, and the game would resume. An awful way to make a living,
And if anything, I got up for the game too early. I got up for it really early. And I hated to play poorly, and knew I was tremendously capable of playing poorly, but I hated it.
The remarkable thing about Glenn Hall, and scary at the same time, was the fact that he had to face the hardest shot in the history of hockey, Bobby Hull, in practices. And Hull was a headhunter.
I remember Glenn telling me one time, he said, Bobby, he, didn't care who the other goalie was. People thought he should take it easy on his own goaltender, but he didn't. And Glenn said, I was in danger out there, and it was obvious just talking to him about it. He didn't enjoy that too much.
He hated training camp, and he had a farm out in Western Canada. So he didn't want to come to camp, and he always wanted more money. 2 good reasons every fall to paint the barn.
He used to always talk about his barn like, I think, well, it would take him a month to paint, right? You could probably paint it in a half an hour. That's the kind of barn he had. But he was smart. He was smarter than all of us.
The true story is that I told Tommy Ivan, the general manager in Chicago, that my intention was to retire. And then when training camp did open, well, I wasn't there. And so like the phone's ringing, and I had been painting this barn, but it's not a big, beautiful barn. It's a little raggedy barn that I was painting, and so I tell my wife, well, tell him I'm painting the barn, and so it just ran off from that, and so I've been painting the barn and it still needs paint.
He set a record that I'm sure will never be broken. You say that about records, and often they are broken. But Glenn Hall played 502 consecutive NHL games in goal without a mask, and I'm sure that's one record that'll stand forever.
I mean, that is insane. Never mind stupid helmets, because I never cared about helmets. But a mask, a goalie's mask, oh yeah. For him to play over 500 games in a row without a mask is something special.
After a standout career in Chicago, Glenn went on to play with the expansion St. Louis Blues, where he continued to make his mark.
I think most people that rate goaltenders all time, they always have Glenn Hall in the top 2 or 3 goalies. I mean, that's how good he was. And in St. Louis, I mean, I don't think it's happened very often. He won a Conn Smythe Trophy, and the team lost 4 straight in the finals. But He was the franchise, and he was 36 or 37 years of age.
He was just a remarkable goaltender playing for an expansion team. And when he won the Conn Smythe Trophy one year in the Stanley Cup playoffs, even though his team had lost the finals 4 straight, nobody disagreed with the choice because he had been so strong.
For a young Saskatchewan boy, a Stanley Cup, 3 Vezina trophies, and 7 first-team All-Star selections are more than he ever dreamed of.
I don't think any of us believed for a minute that we were going to be professional hockey players. We enjoyed playing hockey out in the street, playing shinny, doing whatever you did, and to elevate to the level of the National Hockey League for myself was almost unbelievable. I didn't think for a minute that hockey players come from little towns in Saskatchewan.
To be a successful professional athlete, I think it has to come from within.
Growing up in northern Alberta, Norm Ullman showed early on that he had what it takes.
First organized team I played for, I was about 10 years old. In Edmonton, called Maple Leaf Athletic Club, and I think the sponsor was Stinson's Bakery. We were out there every day, you know, playing on the ice and trying to hone our skills. You didn't want to stop and go in, so you'd just keep going, and then after, when you got home, take off you had your skates off, and just the feet would start just tingling and burning and hurting, and I could remember rolling on the floor in pain.
After showing his form with junior and minor pro Edmonton teams, Norm found himself in a Detroit jersey in 1955, on the ice with 2 of the greatest names in hockey, Howe and Lindsay.
When you get there, you're in awe to begin with. What am I doing here, you know, so to speak? But you figure you're there, you're a rookie, so you don't say too much. You just do what you're told and play when you get the chance.
He worked very hard. He had a good shot. He skated well. He stick handled well, and he was a bulldog when he was on the ice. I mean, he worked the whole time. When you're playing him, you better bring your A game, because if you don't, he's going to eat you for lunch.
Tremendous competitor, you know, always had a little mean streak in him. You challenged Norm Ullman, he was the first guy to, you know, give you a little two-hander in that.
The man could pass the puck to you in a crowd and find you on the tape. Stick handle in a phone booth. He was that good.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things I enjoyed most was making a pass right on the stick, maybe feathering it through 2 or 3 players and right onto the streaking winger's stick and putting them in for a chance on goal.
He was kind of a quiet superstar, you know, that probably didn't get the accolades he deserved. You know, he did everything well. He wasn't the greatest skater, but he got there, and he didn't have the greatest shot, but he scored a lot of goals. Ullman could win face-offs. He was very trustworthy to play against the other team's best players, and I am sure it would be a joy to coach Norm Ullman.
Donning a Toronto jersey in 1968, Norm Ullman's competitive spirit made him one of Coach Punch Imlach's favorites.
Norm Ullman was a quiet man, almost monosyllabic as far as that goes, in the dressing room and on the ice, but he led by example. He used to put his head down and go and take that puck, and he carried everyone with him. He was an inspirational player in a quiet way.
Whenever he did speak, we all listened, and so he didn't waste his words, but he got right to the gist of things.
One of the best players in the history of the league that's never won a Stanley Cup.
I wasn't the most gifted skater or didn't have the hardest shot or a lot of the other abilities individually, but I think determination and desire had a lot to do with my success.
Norm Ullman was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1982.
Well, I've always said that I'd rather be lucky than good, because I've seen a lot of good guys lose, but I've never seen a lucky guy lose. Well, I came up from a big family, 9 boys and a girl. I was the youngest. Unfortunately, I broke my leg when I was 7 years old. But my dream was to become a hockey player. And this leg was broken in half. And really, I never developed a muscle my whole life.
Despite his injury, Dickie Moore soldiered on. He was a trooper, and by 1949 he was well on his way, playing on the winning Memorial Cup team with the junior Montreal Royals.
I was about 15 or 16, and they brought me up to play junior A, and Dickie Moore was actually the captain of the team. And I was fortunate enough on my very first shift, I scored a goal playing with Dickie, but it was a pretty easy tap-in goal. He could have scored the goal, but he was that kind of a player. He was a big team player.
By Christmas 1951, Dickie Moore was with the Montreal Canadiens at the Forum. As a result of his childhood accident, Dickie was never a great skater, but he more than made up for it with grit and commitment.
I wasn't the biggest built kid, but I felt I had a big heart. I could match anybody.
When he came to Madison Square Garden, the fans chanted, "Get more, get more, get more." They didn't chant, "Get Richard." They didn't chant, "Get Geoffrion." They didn't chant, "Get Beliveau." They didn't chant, "Get Harvey." Get more. And that said everything you had to know about Dickie Moore as a competitor.
I enjoyed playing out of town. And I had a lot of fans. They booed the hell out of me all the time. They cheered me. They used to call me Ding Dong. They'd ring bells, you know, and I'd say, well, listen, at least they know me.
Fiery Dickie Moore goes end-to-end in a dazzling rush. Across to Dickie Moore, using Geoffrion as a screen, and scores!
The mid-50s were the glory years for the Montreal Canadiens. Alongside Rocket and Henri Richard, Dickie Moore would twice top the National Hockey League scoring race. Determination was his hallmark.
This guy won a scoring championship playing with a broken hand. He said, "No, I will not stop playing. You, doctor, will put a cast on my arm, and I will continue playing, and I will win the scoring championship," which he did. Now, how many people can make that statement?
Since time began, the player tried to play the game without sweating, and it doesn't work that way. And he was totally prepared to sacrifice everything, and he sacrificed his body. 4 operations on this leg, 3 on the other leg, a concussion where the room turned for 10 days. Came back after that, the doctor says, "Moore, Dickie, you're gonna have to wear a helmet." I get back into the room with the coach. He says, "You wear a helmet, you don't play this game." So I had to play without a helmet.
We didn't call him Wounded Knees for nothing. I mean, this guy, I remember once we were out in the West Coast, and we were at a hotel in Victoria, very quiet, you know, it's around tea time. All you could hear is the tinkling of the cups. But as we walked along, Dickie and I, you heard crack, crack, crack. I said, "Hey, Dickie, what's that?" He says, "What's that?" "It's my knees."
But nothing could destroy Dickie's indomitable spirit on an almost unbeatable team. And from 1956, 5 consecutive Stanley Cups belonged to the Canadiens. So for Dickie, talk of being traded to arch rivals Toronto was like the end of the world.
I wouldn't accept a trade or go play for another team. It hurt. It broke my heart, really. Of course, that's part of the game, but I was too proud to accept it.
After a year off, Dickie missed the game and finally agreed to play a season for the Maple Leafs. But when the expansion St. Louis Blues were formed, Dickie, the warhorse, was in demand once again.
It was amazing that he came and played In fact, during the playoff games, he would go, I don't think he left the rink. He'd come down in the morning, the trainer worked on his knees, he iced them and did treatments on them just to get him through the hockey game. It was amazing. He was like 38 years of age. Scored real key goals for us.
After the 1968 playoffs, Dickie would leave the game he loved, but his passion would last a lifetime.
Well, I've always said, and I think a lot of my ex-teammates can tell you, that you just can't buy the fun this game gives you.
He's a fabulous guy. He's become a fabulous businessman, and he's a great guy to know, and he's a great man for charity.
I think the world's very blessed to have a guy like Dickie Moore, you know, for what he's done, both on and off the ice for the people in not only in our sport, but for the people that have been in need. And he stepped forward. He's always stepped forward. So I think the world's a very lucky place to have a Dickie Moore.
People were telling me that, oh, you're too small. You know, you're going to take a beating, and you're going to get hurt. And so I took that as a challenge, I guess.
Dave Keon grew up in Noranda, Quebec, where winter comes early and stays late. Hockey was a way of life.
A group of kids would come, and they'd be from my age, which was 7 or 8, to 15-year-olds. So they'd pick up teams, and you got your chance to go out on the ice and play. And if you got run over by a 15-year-old, that was too bad. That was just part of growing up. And if you wanted to play, that's what you had to put up with. Winters were pretty cold, and there was no television, so you were kicked out of the house, so you had to do something. So hockey was the first option.
Dave won a place at St. Michael's College in Toronto, a training ground for the Maple Leafs, where on-ice lessons stressed the importance of being a complete hockey player.
I said I didn't want to learn to check. I said, well, if you want to play and be successful, you're going to have to learn to check, or else you're going to have to be able to score 3 goals a game. And if you can do that, you don't have to check. Well, I came to the realization that I wasn't going to score 3 goals a game.
In 1960, 20-year-old Dave Keon donned the Maple Leaf jersey. A memorable 20-goal rookie season won him the Calder Trophy. In the early 60s, Toronto was the team to beat.
Start of the year, what are our goals? Our goals to win the Stanley Cup. Or to die trying.
The Leafs' commitment paid off. Beginning in 1962, they were Stanley Cup champions for 3 consecutive seasons.
It was hard work, but it was fun. When it was over, we were really satisfied with what we'd done. And I still, to this day, I remember the first time we won, seeing Alan Stanley, Tim Horton, George Armstrong, John Bauer, just how happy they were, the looks on their faces. They've been playing for 12, 14, 15 years, and this is the first time they'd won. And here I am in my 2nd year. I think this happens all the time. I come to find out that it doesn't.
But in fact, Dave Keon led Toronto to their 4th Cup of the decade, beating the Canadiens in the 1967 Stanley Cup Final. Keon was the most outstanding player and earned himself the Conn Smythe Trophy.
I was happy with winning the Conn Smythe Trophy. Yeah. I was happy winning the Stanley Cup because it was the last year of the 16s, and it was 67, and we were playing the Canadiens. And, to me, when you win the Stanley Cup, you always look back. Who did you beat? Did you play the Canadiens, and did you beat them? And yes, we played the Canadiens and beat them. That was the only time from 1956 to 1987, I think, that the Canadiens had lost in the finals.
Every time Montreal would play the Maple Leafs, Dave Keon was the guy they had to stop. He was the Montreal Canadien killer.
If he wasn't scoring, he was shutting down the other big scorers. He was just the kind of player you needed to have to win.
One of the best checkers without being physical, using speed and positioning.
Dave Keon, I think, performed more of the skills that it takes to be a top-notch NHL player better than any other player I've seen.
He was so graceful and so talented, half the time you'd be just watching him and you might miss the rest of the game, but he was putting on his own quiet show, and it was just like watching a ballet. Everything is so beautiful.
Veteran captain George Armstrong retired in 1968. Dave Keon was the man to replace him, with the difficult task of leading the Maple Leafs into a new era.
It's a job, although it's glamorous and everybody thinks it's fun, and it is fun because you're doing something that you've always wanted to do, but it's a job and you got to work hard at it. You just don't show up at 7 o'clock and get ready and go out and do your job. So maybe I was maybe a little more intense than I should have been, but that happened to be how I am, and I tried to bring that to how I played, and to being captain, the same thing.
You know, Dave Keon is the kind of a guy who wouldn't hesitate to go after a player on his own team to tell him what they did wrong, and that it wouldn't be a bad idea to start doing things right. But that's what Dave Keon was all about. That's what hockey's all about. That's what any sport is all about.
He had a lot of pride in his profession, and I think he just wanted other people to approach the game exactly the way he had. For anyone that wouldn't follow someone like this, I think they have the problem, not Dave Keon.
In 1970, Harold Ballard became the Leafs' new owner. It's no secret that Ballard and his players didn't always see eye to eye, and soon relations between Keon and Ballard deteriorated.
Harold was that kind of a guy. Sometimes he rubbed players the wrong way. Sometimes he didn't pay players what they felt they deserved. If I had Dave Keon on my team, I'd pay him whatever he wanted.
It was really a joy to coach him in Minnesota and in Hartford in the WHA after his stormy exit from the Toronto Maple Leafs. And Dave Keon is a kind of a misunderstood guy. You know, he loves the Leafs. He didn't think he was treated as fairly as he should have been at the end of his career. As a result, we didn't see him at the closing of Maple Leaf Gardens, which was a tragedy. I tried my best to talk him into going to that, but knowing Dave as I do, when he makes his mind up about something, you're not going to change him.
He was a complete hockey player, and he wore that Maple Leaf like no other Toronto player I've ever watched.
I'm really happy with the way it went. I didn't think I was going to play it was going to last the first year, and I lasted 21 more. So it was, for me, it was a lot of fun.
Terry Sawchuk, the Detroit Red Wings whiz kid, brings an entirely new puck-stopping technique to the National Hockey League. Crouching like a cat, Sawchuk can move just as fast, despite his 190 pounds and an additional 40 pounds of equipment.
Terry was a moody, introspective. Well, he was a goaltender. I think that explains everything.
Whenever barroom conversation gets around to greatness and goalies old and new, one name like a ghost appears. Terry the Uke Sawchuk. No man, it's claimed, before or since, could match his game.
First 5 years he was in the league, he was the greatest goaltender that ever played. I mean, nobody will ever surpass his talent. I mean, you could throw a handful of rice at him and he'd catch everything, and that's just how good he was.
He'd crouch and just dare you to put the puck, and you couldn't put a P by him. When he wanted to play hockey, nobody was any better than Terry.
I mean, his record speaks for itself. He's the best that ever played.
Terry was a born winner. I mean, can you imagine what he did one year in the playoffs? They won 8 straight games, and he had 4 shutouts. You think that'll ever happen again? 8 games, he had 4 shutouts. I think his goals against average was 1.
He didn't allow a goal in any game played on Detroit ice. Sawchuk is mobbed by his jubilant teammates as the game and the series comes to an end.
He was always a very serious person. I saw him quite often, and I don't know if I ever saw him smile. He was sardonic, and sometimes someone might say to him, "Terry, how do you feel?" And
If he was feeling particularly down, he'd say, "With my hands, dummy."
We were playing in Toronto, and I hit this kid, fired the puck just over the boards, and hit this kid right smacked in the nose and broke his nose to smithereens. And they brought him in the dressing room after. And Terry went over and grabbed his goalie stick and gave it to the kid. And he looked at me and he says, "Morris, don't you tell anybody." You know, he didn't want to be known as the good guy, because that's how he got rid of people, was by being obnoxious, because he was self-conscious.
Don't get on the wrong side of Terry Sawchuk. Otherwise, he will never open the door for you. Believe me. But he's such a compassionate guy when you get to know him.
What fans remember most is not Terry Sawchuk's shortcomings, but his record-setting 103 shutouts, a mark that stands to this very day.
He was an actor. He was a thespian on a stage, as far as I was concerned. And the expressions that he had told you so much about how he felt and how the game was going. I mean, there was pain, there was... Goaltenders never get elated. They don't get a chance when they make a big save. Like a guy can score a goal and he jumps around and waves his stick. And goaltenders have always been very stoic whenever they've made a save. But when things go bad for them, you could just tell. You could just tell how he felt. Every inch of his emotion was there.
Terry's best years may well have been at Detroit, yet he was just as unforgettable in a Toronto jersey. But there was a price to pay.
I once stood beside Terry in the Maple Leaf dressing room. He was wearing only a towel because he was going to get weighed after a heavy practice, and I was really struck by the welts and bruises all over his body. It was just a battlefield of blue and yellow and green.
In 1967 with Toronto, Sawchuk's on-ice heroics helped a veteran Leafs team win the Stanley Cup. But for Terry Sawchuk, the pressures were building.
Only a Sawchuk could tell you himself what kind of physical pressure there was in terms of having to go out there and be a goaltender and not being physically the goaltender that he had been in his glory years with the Red Wings.
In 1969, the New York Rangers became Terry Sawchuk's last port of call.
I think Terry knew that he wasn't going to live very long, you know. He had a fatalistic attitude about him. I always thought he was usually gloomy. He didn't seem to enjoy life at all.
Terry was that way. He's just he seemed, for a man who seemingly had everything, was a very sad individual, which is too bad.
He died way too young. Died way too young. And I think his personality had a lot to do with his death. The fact that he ended up fighting with a teammate. This was a month or 3 weeks after the season was over in New York. And, you know, they got into a fight in the bar, and he should have been at home in Detroit with his family.
Ron Stewart and Terry Sawchuk had roomed together. And they were clearing up their bills. And Ron Stewart insisted to Terry that he owed him some money towards a phone bill. It wasn't much, $8, $9. And since the season was over, they'd had a couple of drinks. And an argument ensued, and Ron took a swing at Terry, and they were asked to leave. And they went back home, and a little argument took place again, and Terry took another swing at Ron, and unfortunately he glanced off and he fell in a barbecue pit. So Terry right away told Stewie that, you know, he was hurt, call a doctor, and they rushed him to the hospital.
I went to the hospital, and when I arrived there, Emil Francis happened to be there, and we got talking, and, you know, of course, encouraging Terry that everything's going to be all right and everything like that.
When I left him before the operation, he took our Detroit Red Wing ring off. He said, "If something happens to me, will you please be sure that my son gets this ring?" I said, "Nothing's going to happen to you. You'll be okay." Unfortunately, it was too late. If the operation had been done maybe earlier, he could have survived. The saddest day in my life in hockey was the day I had to go to the morgue on 2nd Avenue in New York to identify Terry Sawchuk. He was there within a bag, like we carry hockey sticks in, with a tag on his neck. But all I can remember, and I'll never forget it, is looking at Terry Sawchuk and saying to myself, there is the greatest goalkeeper I've ever seen.
Now, Glenn Hall was a very, very low-key guy, and actually a very amusing guy. And whenever he came to New York, he and I would have breakfast together. And I remember him telling me about one of the scariest things that ever happened to him. It had nothing to do with pucks coming at his head. They were playing a game in Boston Garden, and somebody in the top balcony dropped a bulb. And it crashed right about 5 feet in front of him in the crease. And they had just come down from Boston, and he was still shaking over that episode. The remarkable thing about Glenn Hall, and scary at the same time, was the fact that he had to face the hardest shot in the history of hockey, Bobby Hull, in practices. And Hull was a headhunter, and Hull didn't give a damn about the fact that Glenn Hall was a little bit nervous to begin with. And he had to face this crazy guy, Bobby Hull, slap shooting the puck at speeds of in excess of 100 miles per hour. Can you imagine what that was like? It was unbelievable. Glenn Hall is the father of the butterfly style of goaltending that every goalie uses today. And I was the one who invented the description of it. I didn't call it the butterfly, which I think is a phony expression. I called it the inverted V, because when Glenn went down, the pads, his legs went out into the V, which covered both of the posts. And it was very thoughtful, insightful, and was innovative. But I remember a game at the Madison Square Garden, at the old Garden. They were playing the Rangers, and the one guy who tormented Glenn Hall the most was Andy Bathgate. And Andy Bathgate got the puck in front of Hall. It wasn't a breakaway, it was a pass out, and as usual, the Chicago defense was somewhere in New Jersey. They couldn't be bothered. And Bathgate got the puck in front of Glenn Hall, who was like the Indian rubber man. I mean, he could contort himself like no goalie before or since. And Bathgate did a 180-degree move in front, like a windshield wiper, going from one side to the other. And Hall got into this contortion, and then Bathgate went from the second side back to the first, and I actually thought that Glenn Hall would split in half, and there would be two Glenn Halls there, the top part of his torso and the bottom. And of course, Andy put it in past him, which not only, it should have given Hall 10 hernias for the price of one, and all it got was a goal. Glenn was marvelous, and of course I was at the Detroit Olympia when Chicago won its last Stanley Cup. And there's a wonderful story about that, because they beat Detroit to win the Cup. And at that time, the Blackhawks were owned by Jim Norris. And, you know, he's one of the wealthiest guys in the world. The team had stayed at the Leland Hotel, which was the official hockey headquarters. The only problem was that in 1961, when Chicago beat Detroit to win the Cup, the Leland was on its way out to the world of decrepit hotels. In fact, it was about to be torn down. And any hockey team wanted to get the hell out of the Leland as fast as possible. So now the Blackhawks have just won the Stanley Cup. Norris already has a huge party set up in the Windy City at one of the great hotels, the Drake. The guys are going to have champagne and the food galore. The game is over. The interviews are done. They walk out, and there's a blizzard. A blizzard in Detroit in the middle of April. They cannot fly out. So Norris takes the team back to the dumpy Detroit Leland Hotel, and all they had left was beer. So I go up to the room, and this crate, you know, it was like the most depressing Stanley Cup victory party in relation to what it should have been. So, but still the guys are drinking and having a good time, and I'm looking around, and there is my buddy Glenn Hall standing alone in a corner. And I go over to him, and I said, Glenn, you just won the Stanley Cup. How do you feel? And his response was the most understated of any hockey player I ever interviewed upon winning a Stanley Cup. Fischler asked, Glenn, how do you feel? Hall answers exactly in these words, I'm enthused. I nearly dropped dead on the spot. All he said was, I'm enthused. But I knew Glenn, and that him saying that was his enthusiasm quotient at its highest.
Here's Hall of Famer Gump Wardsley, got sent down to Devil's Island, Eddie Shore, and that's what it was. If you were bad in the National Hockey League or did something, they'd send you to Eddie Shore. And he came down to us, and that's where I first got to meet him. And the funny story is that that he had no place to go. We came from Providence to Springfield, the hotels and everything. So I said, well, come home and sleep with me. Well, I lived on a third-floor crow's nest up there, and out in the thing there was an empty crib out in the out in the middle. So I said, I have no bed inside. We only have 2 beds and everything. He said, oh, okay, I'll jump in here. Still a little guy in there. So we had a few beers before I went to bed and everything, and I'm sort of had a few. So anyhow, Rose come running in the morning. Don, come quick, there's a little dwarf sleeping in Cindy's crib. I said, that's just Gump.
I think the only guy where the tension didn't get to was Gump Worsley. I don't think anything in the world would bother Gump Worsley. He would manage to get around it with a dirty crack or a rotten crack or an obscene crack or something. He'd crack the place up. I remember one night I'd got into New York. I'd refereed a game in Syracuse in the American League, and got into New York, and it was around 1:30 when I got down to the hotel, and I figured I need a little libation to go to bed. So I'm down at the place called the Show Bar, and I'm sitting in the corner, and gee whiz, I look up at the bar, and I said, gee, that looks like Gump up there. And I've known Gump since he was yay high. I can remember refereeing Gump's games in Montreal when the only way he'd get from one side of the net to the other was grab the crossbar and swing across like a monkey. That's how small he was then. Anyway, it is Gump. And I go up and I say, hey, Gump, how are you doing? You mind if I sit with you? And he says, no, come on, it's boring. So we're sitting there and really having a good time talking and that. All of a sudden, it's 4 o'clock. And I said, Gump, none of my business. But I said, you're playing Detroit tomorrow night. Shouldn't you be home in bed getting a little sleep? He says, you're right, Red. It's none of your business. So we continue. The next night, they beat Detroit 1-0, and Gump had 54 saves. And they named him number 1 star. He's chasing me off the ice. I won't tell you what he was saying, but he chased me right off the ice, yelling it down the corridor. I only gave 1 penalty shot in my life, and it was Gump and his team were in Detroit, and I called the penalty shot, and they gave it to Howe, and Howe gets about 15 feet from the net and gives a little flick of the wrist, and it's in the net. And Gump says, why, you stupid, and a few adjectives added, you know. He says, why didn't you just chalk up the goal and quit wasting time letting them take the shot?
What I remember about Dickie, aside from the fact, he was a great player, but, these players, they go on, and after a little while, they're not playing as well as they did earlier in their career. And now we're getting into the back nine of Dickie's career. And he was being benched quite a bit, by Toe Blake. And this is something, here's a proud guy, and he doesn't want to be benched. He wants to play. And after a game in Chicago, I believe it was, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. There's a knock on the door. Open the door, it's Dickie Moore. "What are you doing here, Dickie?" He said, "I just wanted to tell you I'm quitting. I'm going home. I'm not going to sit on that bench any longer." I said, "Are you out of your mind?" I said, "We're 2 or 3 days away from Christmas. The Canadians are playing in Detroit. You go home now. After the career you've had, people remember Dickie Moore as being a quitter and nothing else." He said, "Well, I just can't take this business of sitting on the bench. I'm not going to do it." But we talked on and on. But 5 in the morning, finally, a breakthrough. He says, "Okay, I'll go to Detroit and see what happens there." He says, "But what's happening to me?" He said, What's going on?" He says, "Why can't I score?" I said, "You can't score, Dickie, if you don't shoot. You have to shoot the puck to score a goal." A couple of nights later, we're in Detroit. He's in the starting lineup. Henri Richard is facing off. He passes the puck back to Dickie. Dickie is about 5 feet this side of the center ice red line. He brings a stick back, whack, whoosh, right under Terry Sawchuk's arm into the net. Dickie jumps up and down, skates down the boards, goes behind the net, comes up the other side of the rink, and the press box above there, waves his stick up at me, and then keeps on going. He scored another goal in that game, and this was a pretty happy guy after the game because he stayed, he played out the year with the Canadians, and that was it, but he didn't quit. And of course, Dickie Moore would never, ever quit, no matter what he said.